All right, joining us once again is my good friend, Kevin Hozer Miller, author of the Raven 1 series and the Silver Waterfall, and frequent guest on this channel. You guys remember that he and I were just aboard Harry S. Truman a few weeks ago. Hozer, good to see you once again.
You too, Mooch. Great to be with you.
I'm going to play a sequence that was part of our Harry S. Truman trip where you got to actually wave a pass. So the viewer will note in that sequence, Hozer, the attention placed on foul and clear deck status.
Yes, Mooch. The LSOs there have responsibility for deck status. There's a deck status light in front of them. You can see that the LSOs have their arms up in the air. That's just a signal to everyone that we know that the deck is foul, and when the deck goes clear, we drop our arms and continue waving the approach.
So the feature of an aircraft carrier is only one airplane can land safely at a time. It's not like the international airport near you. And the coordination required to do that right is fundamental. And there are a number of parties involved, and we'll go over that in a second. So let me play this Plat tape. And this is an example of what happens when that communication breaks down.
Three 707, hook up this pass. 503. 503 on glide path, flight at the course and correcting slowly 2 miles. Lock on 4.5 miles, Daniels. 707, right. 707, curve, fly mode 2. 707. Hook up this pass, 707. Affirmative. Affirmative, hook up 707 and 503. 503 on glide path, Letty right, 3/4 mile, quarter ball. 503, Bravo ball, 7.0 bearings.
Roger ball, 27 knots.
Misty 612 primary. 612, go ahead. 1 inbound. Aircraft in the water off the waist. Aircraft in the water off the waist. 707, turn down heading 160. 707.
All right, so obviously that's a very ugly mishap. So joining us for this conversation about exactly what happened there is the guy who was the pilot in the S-3 when that Prowler hit the Viking on the flight deck, my old shipmate, as well as Hozer's shipmate on this cruise, Greg Walleye Wallace. Walleye, it's great to see you again.
Thanks, Mooch. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and be part of this. and just get some of the facts out in the light and talk about what I recall. And we'll see. We'll see how your viewers feel after they hear some of the things that went wrong that should never, ever happen.
People are very familiar with Hozer's bio as a function of the number of times that he's appeared. Give us the high points of your Navy career.
So started out East Coast Viking community in first deployment on the Nimitz in '87. After that, stayed at Cecil Field in Jacksonville, Florida. After my first sea tour, VS-27 stood up. It was an East Coast S-3 RAG. Did that, split some time there, went over to the Strike Fighter Wing Atlantic for a while. Did my very interesting disassociated tour to Second Fleet in Norfolk on the USS Mount Whitney for about 3 years and a couple of months. Then came back through, did my refresher training, did my department head tour, VS-32, as a maintenance officer almost the entire time I was there. And then came back, screened for command, did ONC, officer in charge of the weapons school at Cecil Field. And then from that point was selected for VS-22 XO. And as you know, those tours usually last 16 to 18 months, XO, and then ramp up to CO. So at the time of this mishap, I was the senior pilot. Our skipper was the senior NFO. And I had been there, just about 6-7 months.
Let's play the Plat tape again, and we'll break it down along the way with both your observations and what you remember as it was happening.
Well, as we're making the approach, and I appreciate you showing this because it does highlight the fact I can fly a night 3-wire okay on centerline. There is video evidence, so that's nice to have.
503-707, hook up this pass.
Okay, so they're calling for hookup because the flight deck is kind of jam-packed at this point because this is Fleet CQ. So already you've got kind of a, let's just call it a traffic jam of sorts going on.
Yes, if you could look out across the bow, there are F-18s packed, and they're all turning. They're getting ready for the next launch. At this point, it's very busy time. We come down. The first thing you'll see is the external lights come off, which indicates, okay, I'm aboard. We pull the throttles aft. The aircraft will actually get pulled aft slightly. This camera pans back to follow the wire that the aircraft arrested because each cable takes a certain number of hits and then they have to change it out. But then in the aircraft, what I'm doing is I'm folding the wings, hook up, folding the wings, and I'm starting to taxi. You'll see the nose of the aircraft actually go forward and then stop because my controlling yellow shirt, my taxi director, who's at about my 1 o'clock position, crosses his lighted wands and stops me right there. And you'll see the wings continue to fold over the top of the aircraft now. And just for everyone's information, there's several thousand pounds of fuel actually still in those wings. Aircraft is destined to be a hot switch that night, which means I'll be taxied off to the side, chock chain. I'll shut down my starboard engine. Myself and my NFO, my right seater, will exit the aircraft. The next crew comes in, gets it fired up again, and they'll go up and get their night trap. As Hozer said earlier, we just needed one night trap to be carrier call.
The coordination of the flight deck, the handler in flight deck control is looking at what we call the Ouija board, which is the representation of where the aircraft are. And he's got guys who actually manually move those pieces around. So he's talking to his directors. And in this case, he tells the guy who's handling you, who's directing you, hold him in place. I'm what he calls looking for a hole. So as you've described, you start to taxi forward, then he gives you the crossed wands, stops you in place.
Exactly. And then in the cockpit, we're running the nose trim, trimming the aircraft for the next crew. So it will be set. We're getting all the switches set up again for the next crew. I actually detached my flashlight from my vest because my flight deck chief is my 3 o'clock position, and he's looking to see if the aircraft is up and ready to fly for the next flight. So I take my flashlight and give him a circle, which indicates it's ready to go. And then I take my flashlight and put it back on the aircraft's dashboard.
So you hear comms for 503, which is the Prowler. 707 is one of your squadron mates, another S-3. The controllers are asking them to call their needles. Mode 2, Hozer, remind us what that is.
Yes, this is a precision approach. The pilot is flying the airplane, but the ship is giving him or her precision needles for glide slope and azimuth.
Airplane calls the ball.
Left, that's Letty right, 3/4 mile, quarter ball. 503 Prowler ball, 7.0 bearings.
Roger.
Okay, so during fleet CQ or RAG CQ or CQ period, you state the pilot's name at the end of the ball call. And so that's why you heard Prowler ball 70 is the fuel state. Barrich is the pilot's last name.
Roger ball, 27 knots.
Okay, so LSO verifies ball call. Roger ball, still flashing F. Okay, so at this point, there is some change in status, but it's time late. We don't see it in this view, Walleye, but you know for a fact that the air boss had situation awareness in the end game here and called over the 5MC, which is the flight deck loudspeaker. No chance paddles, wave him off.
Yeah, correct. Mooch, I actually heard that in the cockpit.
And Mooch, this is a very common call from the boss. I mean, he's got a bigger picture. The LSOs typically have their eyes in the groove, and that's where they should be. But they're cognizant of the deck status. The LSOs need to know what's on the deck. Is there an airplane on the deck or anything on the deck? Then you want to wave the aircraft off to clear the deck by 100 feet. If the deck is clear, but it's still foul, so maybe the gear's not quite set, but it's still foul, you take him as close as you can, and you want to wave him off with at least a 10-foot clearance, and that's tail hook to deck clearance. You can work him in closer there. So those things are happening, but it is not uncommon at all for the air boss that has a bigger picture. He'll tell you in the middle of the pass or even at the start, no chance paddles. And then it's just easy, wave off foul deck and the airplane climbs away for another approach.
But Hozer, you'll agree that call isn't going to come in close. That would be a call that's given,
Correct.
Post ball call, but not in close like this.
Right. It'll typically be given right after the ball call, or maybe in the middle. Certainly before the LSO would have to make that decision, and it's always in the back of your mind, particularly the backup LSO, typically senior. Oftentimes you're training a junior controlling LSO, but not always. But and then the CAG LSO is certainly on the platform, is in the back of their mind. What really is the status? That we know the deck's foul, but how foul is it? And that's going to determine where we wave this guy off.
You don't see it in this view. In the centerline Plat tape, you see it. The air boss has a wave off switch, and he does hit it right as the airplane crosses the ramp here. So you'll see Walleye verified that he never actually touches down.
That was my understanding. Mooch is the mishap team determined that he came within 1 foot of touching down. And I don't know if that's hook to deck clearance, because I think if his wheels were a foot up, he might have had an in-flight. But I have to assume that was a hook to deck 1 foot.
So this is evidence that he did see the wave off lights. They did come on, but obviously time late here.
Yes, and one of the things people ask me and have asked me in the past is, well, couldn't he see you? He being Gumby. And the pilot's not looking in the landing area. He's flying the ball, and he's looking at center line, and he's looking internal to the cockpit. And on wave off, as you've already indicated, he keeps that, somewhere hopefully 15-degree angle of attack, which is the nose relevant to the horizon, and adds full power and climbs safely out in most cases.
The other thing to note about the Prowler, which was a handful to bring aboard, it rivaled the Tomcat, the A model of the Tomcat, in terms of pilot workload. But the hook to eye, to your point, Walleye, I don't know what the exact number was, but it was pretty high. So to your point, a Prowler pilot absolutely doesn't want to raise the nose on a wave off call. He wants to hold his attitude and advance the power to mill. And it looks like Gumby did in fact keep the attitude, but again, it was time late. So there's the impact. Talk to us, Walleye, about what you remember about that moment and the ejection, so forth.
Yeah, still all these years later, I still have very vivid and clear memory of this entire sequence, including up to which I spent 35 minutes in the water, which, oh, by the way, was 56 degrees before I was plucked out of the water by the helicopter squadron. As the Prowler is making his approach, as I said, we're readying the aircraft for the next crew. So I'm the senior pilot, as I said, and I'm flying with one of our very junior naval flight officers, which is typical. You want to send the old guy with the young guy. And Kirk Sneringer was my COTAC, front right seat, NFO, that evening. And Kirk, brand new Lieutenant JG, really. We did not occupy the rear seats. There are 4 seats in the Viking, all 4 ejection seats. Squadron SOP was not to occupy the rear seats for any CQ. So it was just the 2 of us. So we're preparing the aircraft. Kirk looked at me and said, this doesn't feel right. And I said, no, it's not right. And it's not something you ever want to be comfortable with. And so we went about our business until I heard the 5 no chance paddles wave him off, the 5 MC call. And that was like, in the back of my head was, say what? Seriously? They're okay. Well, they're still working this guy. And then shortly after that, my yellow shirt with the crossed wands that was holding my aircraft in place started running. And, you might think, well, that's not a good sign. I will tell you, the first thing I noticed was the sound. It was as deafening a sound as I have ever heard. First of all, time expanded for me. And I know I've talked to a lot of people that have been in similar situations where time just slows way down, way down. And my first thought was, I can't believe this is happening to me. Then I feel the impact and I'm going forward in the cockpit. My brain is saying, I don't want to do this. I look down, I cover my right hand's already on the lower ejection handle. I cover my right hand with my left hand. I look at Kirk and I say, eject, eject. And in my brain, I again said, I don't want to do this. And then I pulled the handle. It seemed like forever. I think in the S-3, all 4 seats, once ejection is initiated, cleared the cockpit in just under 1 second. So it's an immediate ejection sequence. Back left, back right, front left is a sequence.
So do the back seats fire if they're unoccupied as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. If either seat in the front is armed and you're in group eject. By single eject, all 4 seats will go.
And you were in group eject was the selection?
We always flew, even before the chains were taken off the aircraft on the flight deck before movement, we would be in group eject, just in case. So I don't want to do this. Pulled the handle and nothing happened. That's how time was expanding for me. And then shortly after that, I heard pop, pop. Front right seat motor fired, and my motor fired. And I got to tell you, it was the most incredibly powerful feeling I have ever had. I think those Martin Baker seats, they say, or the Escapac seat, I'm sorry, they say that it's 25 Gs. 25 times your weight is placed on your body when that motor fires. And it was an incredibly powerful feeling. We have head knocker, which means our canopy pokes a hole in the aircraft. The canopies don't blow off. So we hopefully follow through that hole. I remember the very cool night air and it being completely dark at that point. And then the parachute opened and it startled me. And got a full canopy. I couldn't tell you where in the world I was or what I was doing at that point. I had no idea. And then I noticed that my left side of my face was actually literally burning. And so I had a death grip on this ejection handle, and Hozer's heard this story before. But way back when I was still a flight student, I ran into an A7 pilot who had an ejection handle hanging from his rearview mirror. And I thought, now that's cool. And talked to him about the story behind it. And he, in fact, had ejected and held onto his handle, put it on his gated D-ring, kept it. When I saw the fire on my face, I immediately let go of my handle. And then my thought wasn't, oh, I got to put the fire out. The thought was, oh, I dropped my handle. And then I started rubbing my face trying to put the fire out. You know, in an ejection sequence, we're trained, acronyms, as you all know, IROK. And it can be IRK if you're at a low altitude. Inflate your vest, release the raft. So we're strapped to our seat. There's a handle on the right side. We squeeze, we pull it, and the seat bottom actually falls away. What's important about that, O2 deployment, ELT, emergency locator transmitter activation, and your raft will deploy. I didn't do any of that. I rubbed my face until I hit the water. I went straight down. My helmet stayed on, chin straps. I still remember it pulling on my head, straight down, and I bobbed back up. And I was just aft of the ship on the right side, which was very confusing for me because my seat's supposed to go to the left. And I've always thought in my mind as I've played this possible scenario out that I'd be on the port side of the ship. I was on the starboard side, just aft of the round down, and popped back up. Clearly, all of the backup features of my survival gear worked, thanks to all of the mishaps that had occurred in the past where they changed our survival gear to be more automatic. My coke fittings that hold me to the parachute automatically release. So inflate, release, O for options like oxygen mask, you would pull it aside, something like that. And then K for coke, K-O-C-H, fittings, which you would pull up a guard, pull down when your feet hit the water, parachute would go away, and you would not worry about your parachute. Again, I did none of that. I hit the water. My SV2, my vest inflated. I popped back up, and now I'm very confused. about what I'm looking at.
Are you wearing an exposure suit?
No, that's a great question, Mooch. So I had just flown aboard on Friday from Jacksonville, Florida, where I think the temperature was in the upper 80s, close to 90. Didn't fly on Saturday. This mishap occurred on a Sunday. Went out that morning. One of the things we didn't talk about is if it had been a couple of weeks since you'd had a night trap, you had to get a day trap. Then would make you current to go again that night. So Kirk and I had both gone out that morning and gotten a day trap, and I commented on it was in the 60s, how cool it was. And so that night I had put on my liner, but not my dry suit. So I at least had the liner on. Come to find out, of course, the temperature, the water temperature was never briefed. If it's below 60, I think 60 or below 60, they're supposed to brief it, and you're supposed to be in a survival, a wetsuit or some type of gear to protect you against the cold. It was never briefed, so we didn't know what the water temperature was. And so I keep getting washed under from the wake. And eventually the ship's far enough away where that's not a problem. But I'm looking at my home for the next 6 months or so, sail away from me. I can see this dark cloud that's glowing on the flight deck. Again, my aircraft stays on the flight deck and burns for about 10 minutes before they get the fire put out. I can hear calls of general quarters, men overboard, and fire on the flight deck being called out on the 5MC. I had a very good recollection of time in all this too. At the 5-minute point, I heard in my head, I had worked a JAG investigation. We'd lost an F-18 during workups at Fallon that year. Bravo 20, I think, was the bomb range that we lost.
Bravo 19.
19, thank you, Hozer. And I had done the JAG investigation. And during that investigation, I had heard that pilot's right seater tape, where once he realized what had happened, the wingman, I should say, once he had heard what had happened and realized what had happened, on his cockpit voice tape, he said, "Get a grip." And believe it or not, I heard his voice in my head say, "Get a grip." And it was at that point I started to make sure I was physically okay. I knew I'd been burned. I'd seen the burns. I kept trying to touch my face, like my lips, they were all chapped and burned. And at that time, I heard a helicopter. So I kind of turned myself and off. I don't know if it was 100 yards, somewhere around there. It was a helicopter and a hover. And I thought, oh, this is awesome. They're going to pick me up. I'm going to have a great story. And, here we go. And reached right in, just like you're trained, pulled out of my survival gear, my pencil flare, held it over my head, and fired it in the air. And I waited another 2 minutes for a response, and I got nothing. And I thought, well, okay, let me reload it. We have 6 cartridges, I believe, in a little pink plastic, red plastic case. So at that point, now I didn't have my gloves on, 2nd-degree burns on back of both hands. I tried to take the spent cartridge out of the flare gun, and I couldn't. My hands were shaking so violently, I couldn't grasp and hold. So I did what every college, highly educated person would do. I put it in my mouth and started turning it. And my next thought was, how are you going to load this? You can blow a hole out of the back of your head. Here we go. This will be another good story. So I got real frustrated with myself. That was the first time that night I got frustrated. I knew I wasn't really in control, and that's not a good feeling as an aviator. So it was at that point I started worrying about being cold. And I recalled that I did not deploy my raft. So I squeezed the handle, pulled it. Now I didn't know how. What do you do then? If you don't deploy it in flight and you're in the water, what do you do then? So I kept reaching down, I could find a lanyard and I'd pull on it. But I found out later through the flight physiology trainers that there's a lanyard that comes from each side of the seat to a single lanyard down, which makes sense. I kept grabbing the other lanyard for 3 or 4 tries, and eventually got below the V and kept pulling, and here came my raft right beside me. And we all worn the flight gear and tried to climb into a raft in the swimming pool, and how hard that was. This was a piece of cake. I just climbed right in and rolled over. It was a beautiful thing. So now I'm in the raft. I keep hearing helicopters, and I heard there were at least 4 airborne that night. I kept hearing them. I couldn't see them necessarily. So again, I got in the huddle, the help position, where you kind of put everything in. I reached in, pulled my strobe light, tried to put it on my helmet, and it fell off, my strobe light fell off into the water because the Velcro on the helmet, I found out later, had melted off. And so, all of our gear is tied to us. So I pulled it back out of the water. So I was sitting, as I would eventually hear helicopters, I'd try to follow them with my strobe light. So here I am floating in the middle of the ocean, no chance of helping myself. It's a very humbling feeling when you're there. Again, I kept trying to determine how badly my face was burned. And unfortunately, the last several years, we've seen a lot of our men and women return from combat and situations that have been severely burned. And in my mind, I thought that's how I looked. And there was a voice that came into my head while I'm floating in the raft that said, "You don't want to put your family through this, do you? You don't want them to see your face. You shouldn't put them through that pain. Why don't you climb out of the raft, put your head under the water, and I will take all your pain, but more importantly, your family's pain away. They will never have to look at you." It's a voice, just a calming, strong, compassionate voice. And immediately, another voice comes in and says, "No, we can deal with this. I will carry you through this. I will take care of you. Trust me, rely on me." And these voices went back and forth for, I don't know, a good minute, maybe 2 minutes. And I don't know if I said it out loud or just screamed it in my head, "Stop. I'm not getting out of the raft." So I was there another 10 minutes or so, kind of, I don't know, not really focused and thinking clearly, just trying to survive. And at some point, I said, again, I don't know if it was out loud or just in my head, "God, please help me." I knew I couldn't help myself. And as soon as I said that, I got to tell you, there was a warmth that came from the back of my head, the crown of my head, through my body. And there was a real sense of hope and strength. Now, it didn't last long. It didn't last for more than, maybe a minute. But 3 times in that raft, that happened to me. And I asked and received. Shortly after the 3rd time, I hear a helicopter approaching. And I hear the Doppler. I can tell it's closing on me. Finally, I see the light shining on me. They're coming over. I remembered, okay, you got to pull your visor down, right, for the spray. So I reached up. My visor had split in half, right down the middle, but it was still attached to my helmet. So I pulled that down. And honestly, my last prayer that night in the water was, please let there be a search and rescue swimmer on that helicopter, because I had not an ounce of energy. Hover, I see and feel this person hit the water beside me. He comes up and he says, ask me my name. I told him my name. He said, what squadron are you with? I told him. He said, how are you physically? I said, fine, I'm really cold and tired. He said, that's why I'm here. And so I felt Petty Officer Greg Learman, who was the search and rescue swimmer, going all around. I didn't have any idea what he was doing, but eventually he said, okay, sir, I'm going to put this ring on you. They're going to hoist you up and you're not going to do anything. I said, that I can do. I can do nothing. And so they did. And it was a wonderful feeling when my feet left the water. They pulled me into the helicopter. And as soon as they got me situated in the helicopter, they're pestering me with my name, squadron, all this sort of stuff. I didn't realize at the time they were trying to keep me awake because the world was kind of closing in, getting a little gray around the edges. And I asked him if they'd found my right seater, Kirk. At the time, his call sign was Ringer. Schneeringer is his last name, Ringer. Said, have you found Ringer? And they said, well, sir, his parachute hung up on the ship's antenna. And I said, you mean he didn't go in the water? And they said, yeah. I said, great. I said, what about the other airplane? They said, well, we're still looking. And I asked him to stay out and try to find the other folks. I said, it's really cold and you need to pick them up. And they said, we'll get you back and we'll come right back out. I said, okay. Got back aboard the ship, great medical care. I remember they put me in a gurney, wheeled me behind the island, into the island. The next thing I remember is these giant scissors coming out. And I'm like, let's be real careful with those guys. I don't want to survive this and see some scissor action here. And there was a chaplain and saw the cross on him. He came up and said, I'm here for you, son. I said, I'm glad you are. I said, I hope I don't need you, but I'm glad you're here. And took me down to medical, I think on a weapons elevator. What was weird about that is medical in the passageway, my squadron ready room door is just across the passageway from medical. And I saw my name on the door. It was the XO and our squadron logo. And we went that way. We went to the right. And my thought was, will I ever come back here? Will I ever go in there again? Got some great medical care. X-rays, the highly anticipated catheter, which is a story in and of itself. And then into the main area. My right ringer was already in the main area of medical. They hooked me up, came in. We had a female commander who I believe had just reported aboard the ship and had been at Kelly Air Force Base in the burn clinic there. You talk about an amazing coincidence. And she and her team then proceeded to start cleaning the burns, as they have to do. They have to clean them, get all the dead skin away. So I had one on each hand and my legs were burned. In the S-3, because we don't wear G-suit, when a rocket motor fires, there's a flame that tunnels. It was a known fact at the time, but nobody ever did anything about it. Tunnels up under our flight suit. And I had burns between where my dry suit liner was and the top of my boots. I had burns all the way around. Back of the neck, hands, face, burned 2nd degree. Pretty bad. Beat up, really bad.
I was able to go to medical sick bay and asked if I could visit Commander Wallace, and they let me. And so Walleye was in his bed there. He had a witness mark around his face from where his helmet and his skull cap was. But everything, his face here was just a bad sunburn. And as Walleye talked about, the medical personnel had put the cream on his face and were treating those bad burns. Of course, his hands were all completely bandaged. I remember Swinger was in the bed next to you as I visited then, and a poignant moment there. But months later, Walleye, I'll never forget when you came into the Ready 3 and talked to my aviators about this experience, and they will never forget you telling them about putting the pencil flare in your mouth as you're trying to put it in the launcher and signal. Another takeaway that I recall from you, and you fessed up that you know what, you should have been wearing a dry suit. The 56-degree water, and it got cold really fast. And so for the rest of that deployment, we were in the much of it in the Mediterranean in the wintertime. And I said, guys, until it's 60 degrees, you're wearing dry suits. Go bribe the weather guy if you want to, but if it's until it's 60, you're wearing them. And I'll add this, around the ship, NATOF says you do not need to wear gloves. And so that is an optional thing. And so aviators can choose to wear them or not. And I have worn them and not. And I've gone back and forth. At the end of my career, I thought, I've tried to get the Coke fittings off with my wet gloves, but then after talking to you and hearing your story, it really brought home, using gloves, wearing gloves is a valid option. Mooch, when you and I went to the ship a few months ago, hardly anyone was wearing gloves, and I saw a lot of flight suits that were rolled up to the elbow as guys are taking their cat shots, and hanging on to the towel rack there, and I believe that's wrong, but you see that a lot, and so I know that a lot of flight students are watching this channel as they should, and guys, roll those sleeves down all the way to the wrist, and that's the way to do it. You can make an option for gloves or not once you get to the fleet.
Because Ringer's parachute hung up on the ship's antenna, and as I tell him, he wasn't man enough to go swimming that night. His call sign went from Ringer to, of course, Swinger, and which it is still to this day.
What did he remember about getting hung up on the antenna?
He said he remembered me calling ejection, and he said, "That's a good idea," in his head. That's a good idea. The next thing he remembered was looking down after his parachute had opened, he was looking down at the island. His parachute hung up and he swung down. And his last thought was, this is going to hurt. And it knocked him out. And great, I've got the letter from a petty officer that saw him hanging there and actually got some help, got a rope around him and pulled him up to safety and got him down to medical.
So where was this petty officer located, on Vulture's Row or something? Or he's
I
up there
think
on
so.
the island?
I think so, yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
So truly a tragic story, an accident, a mishap that honestly, there are so many people in that chain that could have stopped this, but didn't. And the point in this is, how fragile we all are, number one, and how fragile flight operations on an aircraft carrier can be.
Yeah, no doubt. So you mentioned to the helo crew, you beseech them to go out and find the Prowler crew. We'll mention that all 4 of the occupants of that Prowler were killed in the mishap. Killed were Lieutenant Commander Kurt Barrich. His ECMOs were Lieutenant J.G. Charles Woodard, Lieutenant J.G. Meredith Loughran, and Lieutenant J.G. Brendan Duffy. So a very junior crew, probably for the same reasons you're talking about, with respect to the CQ part of the evolution. It was good for the junior folks to get traps in a low stress environment. I will mention that at the time of this mishap, I had just shown up from being CAG Ops to the Naval Academy on the staff there, and Brendan Duffy was from Annapolis, and I was there when the missing man formation of Prowlers flew over his memorial service a few months after that mishap, a very moving, solemn event. So, Hozer, let's talk about some of the findings of the mishap report. So, starting with the LSOs, what was determined in terms of their responsibilities and where they fell short?
LSOs are responsible for safe and expeditious recovery of aircraft. And so at night, the interval, roughly 1 minute between airplanes, you want to get them aboard. However, you've got to know what the status is of the deck, and the LSO has got the pickle. The LSO makes a determination for the foul deck wave off, and again, that 100-foot clearance or that 10-foot clearance. So you've got to know. Now, Enterprise was a unique ship, and this was one of the unique features of Enterprise, where the LSO platform was pretty far to the port side. Now, Nimitz-class carriers, like you and I were on Harry S. Truman a few months ago, will park an airplane on what's called the finger, and this is near the elevator for it. It's right next to the LSO platform. Oftentimes, there's an airplane parked there. Many times, that airplane is turning to add another 120 decibels to the LSO experience. But you must look underneath that aircraft forward and see the status of the deck. With Enterprise, you had to walk out there quite a ways on the flight deck. I'd say 10 feet or so, and then crouch down and look forward. Now, I waved on Enterprise as a lieutenant when I was an instructor at VFA 106. So that ship had that characteristic. The one of the findings was that you've got to have an LSO out there, as we saw just 2 months ago, that's in front of the two LSOs that are with their eyes in the groove where they should be. But this LSO is looking forward and then assessing the landing area. Now, we began this, I recall, and Walleye, you may remember this. Of course, Walleye and I were LSOs as lieutenants on Nimitz, and so Walleye is well steeped in what LSOs do. But I recall that there was a signal, like, what we're going to, above the head was 100 feet, and maybe at your knees was 10 feet. You can take them to 10 feet. And now, as you and I saw 2 months ago, Mooch, that LSO is out there, making a verbal call or whatever they were using. But that began from this mishap on this very unique ship.
And the timing, as we see in that footage of you waving, is critical. I mean, seconds matter. Even in your pass, they're taking the guy pretty close when the deck is still foul.
Yes, and that was crossing my mind 2 months ago. Okay, how close are we going to work this guy? And I briefed the backup LSO. All right, you have got responsibility for wave off lights.
The other thing mitigating, or that came out in the mishap investigation, was the sodium lights weren't working on the flight deck. That wasn't really a contributing factor, but it was a factor. The cord for the handset wasn't long enough for the LSO to even go far enough into the LA to see forward. So that's a problem. You can't even stretch it far enough to get to that point of view that you're talking about, Hozer. And we mentioned that the 5MC was not operating correctly, and so they were having trouble hearing the air boss. And so the controlling LSO took the foamy out of his ear and was crouched closer to the speaker to try to hear what he was saying. So all of this departure from normal routine on the platform caused inattention, right? This breakdown on the platform. Now, meanwhile, the breakdown in Pryfly is the other thing that's really, unsat, to put it mildly, as Walleye said at the outset, the breakdown that happened both on the platform and in the tower. So what we're talking about in this case is that responsibility lives with the air boss. Now, during the approach, his observer, one of the enlisted guys looking aft, kept saying, "The deck is foul. The deck is foul." And the air boss missed those calls or was focused on something else. So Walleye, I don't know, was he focused on you in the landing area at the expense of paying attention to the airplane to 503, do you think? Or do we know where his focus was that caused him to drop the ball here?
That's a great question, and I've thought about that a lot, Mooch. My only guess is either he was talking to somebody about the status of the F-18s and when they would be able to spot me and get me out, or his focus was just forward. But clearly, it wasn't on the aircraft making the approach. Another thing I would add to the LSOs, and Hozer, you remember this, first couple of, maybe first week underway, all the LSOs like to go out and kind of calibrate your eye. So there was, the LSO school can tell you, or maybe it's in your report, I believe there were between 8 and 10 squadron LSOs on that platform, just hanging out, calibrating their eyes. So it's not just the 3 or 4 guys, including the talker, that are out there. This was a gaggle that was on the platform that night. And also keep in mind, the captain of the ship has the most responsibility and has a wave off light as well.
The other thing to just double click on in this scenario is this phase of deployment. As you mentioned, Walleye, 24 hours before you're at home, and the transition between saying goodbye to the wife and kids and getting your game face on, it varies by individual. And obviously it's mitigated by whatever trauma might be happening on the home front, the reaction of your spouse or your kids to your departure. So this is a very precarious period in terms of the phase of deployment. And I remember it well. You're kind of in this haze. You're a little bit numb, where you're trying to get focused on the next 6, or these days 10 months ahead of you. So like we said, the presence of mind that you depend on with an air boss or a controlling LSO may have been lacking as a function of the phase of deployment. Further, the air boss particularly has to pay attention to a bunch of things at once, right? The phones are ringing. He's getting, the intercom is beeping. The captain has a hotline to him. He's hearing from air ops. It's crazy up there. It's Wall Street on steroids. But as you mentioned, Walleye, he has a hierarchy that he has to keep straight. It's the old aviate, navigate, communicate thing. And in this case, trying to figure out what you're going to do with the Hornets on the bow kind of is under the communicate hierarchy. Aviate is that airplane inside the ball call that is still coming. And all so far is LSO's rogered the ball call, and there hasn't been any other comms afterwards. The other thing that jumped out at me is there are 20 seconds of silence after that collision. So that just strikes me as everybody's just stunned and paralyzed about what just happened. 20 seconds. And finally, somebody keys the radio and says 7, and then stops, and then calls for the Dusty Dogs to come find you off the waist. And so that's another indicator of the level of confusion and obviously shock and disbelief at what just happened.
Yeah, that voice from the Dusty was their CO. He was airborne that night.
Well, it's a cliche, a very true one, unfortunately, that NATOPS is written in blood. The other thing we could say is CV NATOPS is written in blood. And Hozer and I saw evidence of that when we were just on Harry S. Truman, in terms of the way that the LSOs are focused on the LA, as Hozer mentioned, as a function of this mishap. So, Walleye, thanks for joining us for this deep dive on your experiences. As a friend, a longtime friend, obviously I'm grateful you survived this mishap. And our thoughts go out to the families of the fallen here. because 4 of our shipmates did not make it through this particular event.
So true. You know, I remember the event 720 on November 8th every year by going outside and a toast to those 4 men and women and their families because they remember that day much differently than I do. And I think it's important. It's one of the reasons I like to talk about this, Mooch, is it's important to remember we've got men and women out there as we speak doing what we all did and what resulted in this mishap. Never lose that and never take it for granted.
And the way we honor their memory is by doing it right going forward.
Exactly.
No one wanted this to happen. And lessons learned, and we can see evidence of that, you and I, some 25 years later out of the ship, that lesson has been taken to heart.
Hozer, as always, thank you for joining us with your expertise. And we also look forward to having you on the channel again very soon.
Thanks, Mooch.
All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything going forward. In the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.